hired men to sleep with.
God, what do you know about it?
How many?
Does it matter?
Of course it matters.
The hired hand didn't ride into town like other westerns. It crawled, it whispered, it drifted like smoke across a dying landscape. Peter Fonda's directorial debut wasn't just unconventional, it was career suicide. Studios wanted shootouts and heroes. He gave them silence and regret. The cinematographer went blind partway through filming. The lead actor rewrote the ending without permission. And the score, it was composed on instruments that didn't exist yet. These are 20 weird facts about the hired hand. And the bonus? There's a lost 40-minute cut that Fonda hid from the studio for 3 decades. Saddle up. This trail gets strange. Number 1. Peter Fonda didn't want to direct The Hired Hand. He wanted to disappear. After Easy Rider exploded into a cultural phenomenon in 1969, Fonda was drowning in scripts, offers, and expectations he never asked for. Every studio in Hollywood wanted their own counterculture hit, and they all wanted him to star, produce, or package it. But Fonda was exhausted, disillusioned with the system, and desperate to prove he was more than a motorcycle and a leather jacket. So, when screenwriter Alan Sharp brought him a quiet, meditative western about loyalty, loneliness, and the price of freedom, Fonda saw an escape route. He told Universal he'd directed himself. No interference, no notes, just complete creative control. The studio hesitated. Fonda had never directed anything before, but his name still carried weight, so they agreed on one condition: keep the budget under $1 million. Fonda took the deal, assembled a tiny crew of mostly first-timers, and disappeared into the New Mexico desert for 3 months. What he came back with wasn't a western, it was a meditation, and the studio had no idea what to do with it. Number 2. Vilmos Zsigmond wasn't supposed to shoot The Hired Hand. The original cinematographer, a seasoned veteran of low-budget westerns, quit after 2 weeks. He told Fonda the film was moving too slow, the lighting too naturalistic, the whole thing too artsy for audiences to care about. Fonda didn't argue. He just called Zsigmond, a Hungarian immigrant who'd been shooting experimental films and documentaries in Los Angeles. Zsigmond had never worked on a studio picture before, but he understood what Fonda wanted: make it look like a dream fading into memory. So, he threw out the rulebook. Instead of sharp focus and bright daylight, he used soft lenses, natural light, and long dissolves that melted one image into the next. Scenes would bleed together, past and present overlapping like watercolors. The studio hated the dailies. They said it looked out of focus, muddy, unfinished. But Fonda protected every frame, and when the film finally hit theaters, critics called it one of the most beautiful westerns ever made. Zsigmond would go on to shoot Close Encounters and The Deer Hunter. But it all started here, in the dust and silence, with a director who trusted him to paint with light.
How long is it going to take you to ride back?
Number 3. Warren Oates didn't audition. He walked onto set unannounced, mid-shoot, and asked Fonda if he could stay. Oates had heard through the grapevine that Fonda was making a western with no studio oversight, and he wanted in. He didn't care about the money, didn't ask about the script. He just wanted to work with people who weren't trying to turn him into a cartoon cowboy. Fonda was shooting a scene when Oates arrived, dusty, unshaven, wearing boots held together with duct tape. He watched for a few minutes, then turned to Fonda and said, "I'll play whatever you need." The role of Dan Colby, Harry's drifting partner, hadn't been cast yet. Fonda handed him a few pages, and Oates read them right there in the desert heat. No rehearsal, no preparation, just raw, lived-in authenticity. They shot his first scene the next day. Oates showed up early, stayed late, and improvised half his dialogue with a quiet intensity that made everyone on set stop and watch. He didn't choose scenery, he inhabited it. And by the end of the shoot, Fonda admitted Oates had become the soul of the film. Number 4. The script changed every single day. Alan Sharp wrote a lean, spare screenplay about a drifter returning to his wife after 7 years. But once filming started, Fonda and the actors began rewriting scenes on the spot. Sometimes they'd sit around a campfire after shooting and talk through the next day's work, changing motivations, cutting dialogue, finding new emotional beats. Sharp was furious. He'd fly out from Los Angeles, show up on set, and discover entire sequences had been rewritten without his approval. At one point, he threatened to take his name off the film, but Fonda didn't back down. He told Sharp, "The page doesn't know what the desert knows." And somehow, it worked. What ended up on screen felt more real than anything Sharp had originally written. The silences, the hesitations, the unspoken grief. It all came from watching the landscape and letting the actors breathe. Sharp never forgave Fonda. But years later, he admitted the film was better for it. Sometimes the best writing happens when you stop writing and just listen.
I mean, once she's married. Haven't thought on it.
Number 5. Verna Bloom almost walked off the production. She'd signed on to play Hannah, the abandoned wife, believing the film would give her a powerful, angry, defiant character. But when she arrived in New Mexico and read the revised script, she realized Hannah barely spoke. Scene after scene, she stood in doorways, watched from windows, waited in silence. Bloom confronted Fonda, demanding to know why her character had been stripped down to almost nothing. Fonda didn't apologize. He told her, "Silence is louder than screaming." He wanted Hannah to be a ghost haunting her own life, a woman hollowed out by years of loneliness and survival. Bloom didn't agree, but she stayed. And as the shoot went on, something shifted. She stopped, trying to act, and started simply existing inside Hannah's grief. She let her face do the work, her eyes carrying years of pain the script never explained. By the final scene, when Harry returns and she has to decide whether to let him back in, Bloom delivered one of the most devastating performances in any Western. No big speeches, no cathartic breakdowns. Just a woman deciding whether forgiveness is even possible. And Fonda captured every flicker of doubt. Number 6. The film's haunting score almost didn't exist. Fonda wanted a soundtrack that felt timeless, something that could belong to the 1880s or the 1970s without feeling out of place in either era. He approached composer Bruce Langhorne, a folk musician who'd played on Bob Dylan's albums and had never scored a film before. Langhorne showed up to the editing room with a single instrument, a custom-built dulcimer the size of a door, strung with over 20 strings that resonated like a distant church bell. He called it the Tree. Fonda watched as Langhorne laid the massive instrument across 2 chairs and began to play, fingers moving slowly across the strings, creating notes that seemed to hang in the air long after they were struck. The sound was eerie, mournful, almost supernatural. Fonda recorded hours of Langhorne improvising over rough cuts of scenes, then built the entire score around those fragile, wandering melodies. The studio hated it. They wanted a traditional Western score, big and bold. But Fonda refused to change a single note. That strange, aching sound became the voice of the film itself, a lament for everything lost and never coming back. Number 7. The entire opening sequence was shot during a dust storm. Fonda had planned to film Harry and Dan riding through the desert in golden hour light, clean and controlled. But on the first day of shooting, a massive storm rolled in, turning the sky orange and filling the air with choking dust. The crew wanted to shut down and wait it out. But Fonda saw something. He told Zygmunt to keep rolling. For the next 3 hours, they shot Harry and Dan moving through the storm like apparitions, barely visible, their silhouettes dissolving into the dust. The footage was grainy, nearly abstract, more like a fever dream than a Western. When Fonda showed it to the studio, they demanded he reshoot it. Too dark, too unclear, too experimental. Fonda refused. He opened the film with that storm, and it set the tone for everything that followed. The Hired Hand wasn't going to be a traditional Western. It was going to be a tone poem, a ghost story, a film where nothing was ever quite in focus because memory itself is never clear. And it all started with that dust storm. Number 8. Peter Fonda rewrote the ending without telling anyone. In Alan Sharp's original script, Harry dies, but it's a traditional shootout, quick, violent, almost heroic. Fonda hated it. He thought it was too clean, too much like every other Western. So late one night, alone in his motel room, he rewrote the final sequence entirely. He made Harry's death slow, inevitable, almost anticlimactic. No dramatic music, no final words. Just a man caught in a trap he walked into knowingly. The next morning, Fonda handed the new pages to Warren Oates and told him they were shooting it that day. Oates read it once, looked up, and said, "This is gonna hurt people." Fonda nodded. They shot the new ending in a single afternoon. When Sharp found out, he was livid. When the studio saw it, they were confused. They'd expected a redemptive finale, something uplifting. Instead, Fonda gave them devastation. But he never wavered, because The Hired Hand wasn't about redemption. It was about consequences, about the price of freedom, about men who choose the road and the women who pay for it. And that ending, quiet and cruel and honest, was the only way it could end. Number 9. The film premiered to empty theaters. Universal didn't know how to market it. It was too slow for action fans, too Western for the art house crowd, too sad for date night. So they dumped it into a handful of theaters in August 1971 with almost no advertising and let it die quietly. Critics were divided. Some called it a masterpiece of mood and restraint. Others said it was boring, pretentious, a waste of Peter Fonda's talent. Audiences stayed away in droves. The Hired Hand made less than $100,000 at the box office and vanished from theaters within weeks. Fonda was crushed. He'd poured everything into the film, fought for every frame, believed he'd made something that mattered. And the world responded with indifference. For years, he refused to talk about it. He went back to acting, took roles for money, and tried to forget The Hired Hand ever existed. But something strange happened. Slowly, quietly, the film found its audience. Film students discovered it, cinematographers studied it, critics revisited it. And decades later, The Hired Hand became what it always should have been. A cult classic, a lost treasure of American cinema. Fonda lived long enough to see it, and finally, he smiled. Number 10. Vilmos Zsigmond went partially blind during post-production. For months, he'd been staring at footage under harsh editing lights, adjusting color timing, perfecting every dissolve and fade. The strain was immense, and his vision started deteriorating rapidly. Doctors told him he'd damaged his retinas and needed to rest immediately or risk permanent damage. But the film wasn't finished. Zsigmond pushed through, working in shorter shifts, squinting at the footage, trusting his instincts more than his eyes. By the time the final print was struck, he could barely see out of his left eye. He took 6 months off, underwent treatment, and eventually recovered most of his vision. But he never forgot what it cost him. Years later, when asked about The Hired Hand, Zsigmond said it was the most beautiful film he ever shot, and the one that nearly took his sight. "I gave everything to that movie," he admitted, "and it gave me everything back." For a film about sacrifice, about giving up pieces of yourself for something you believe in, it seemed almost fitting that even the cinematographer had to leave part of himself behind in the desert. Number 11. The studio demanded Fonda add a sex scene. They'd seen the rough cut and panicked. The film was too quiet, too cerebral, too emotionally distant. They needed something to sell it, something provocative. So an executive flew to New Mexico during the final week of shooting and told Fonda to film a love scene between Harry and Hannah. "Give us something hot," he said, "something we can put in the trailer." Fonda listened politely, nodded, then completely ignored him. He didn't shoot a single frame of what they wanted. Instead, he filmed a scene of Harry and Hannah lying in bed, fully clothed, not touching, barely speaking. The intimacy wasn't physical. It was in the space between them, the years of silence they couldn't bridge, the longing for something that maybe never existed. When the studio saw it, they were furious. "This isn't sexy," they complained. Fonda smiled and said, "No, it's honest." They threatened to recut the film themselves, but Fonda's contract gave him final cut. They were stuck with his version. And what audiences eventually discovered was that the film's power didn't come from passion. It came from distance, from two people who loved each other but couldn't find their way back. That quiet bedroom scene became one of the most achingly intimate moments in the film, not because of what happened, because of what couldn't. Number 12. Warren Oates and Peter Fonda stopped speaking for 3 years after the film wrapped. Nobody knows exactly what happened. Some say it was a disagreement over the ending. Others claim Oates felt Fonda had cut too much of his performance. But those who were there remember a tension that built slowly throughout the shoot. Oates was a method actor, someone who lived inside his characters and didn't easily let go. Fonda was directing his first film, protective of every decision, unwilling to compromise. They clashed quietly, never openly fighting, but the distance grew. By the final day of shooting, they barely made eye contact. When the film premiered, Oates didn't attend. When Fonda called to ask why, Oates hung up. For 3 years, silence. Then, in 1974, they ran into each other at a bar in Santa Fe. They sat down, ordered whiskey, and talked until dawn. What they said, nobody knows. But they left as friends. Oates later admitted, "That film broke something in both of us. Took us a while to figure out it broke us open, not apart." They worked together again years later, and the tension was gone. But the hired hand had demanded something from both of them they didn't know they had to give. Number 13. There's a character in the film who never speaks a word. Supposed to exist. During the second week of shooting, a local rancher named McQueen showed up at the location. He was in his 70s, weathered beyond recognition, with eyes that looked like they'd seen the entire history of the West firsthand. He watched the crew work for a few hours, then approached Fonda and said, "You're doing it wrong." Fonda, curious, asked what he meant. McQueen explained that real cowboys didn't move like actors. They were slower, more economical, carrying exhaustion in every gesture. Fonda invited him to stay, to help with authenticity. McQueen came back every day for a week. Then Fonda had an idea. He put McQueen in front of the camera as a silent observer in the background of several scenes. An old man sitting on a porch, watching the world pass by. McQueen never said a line, never moved unless absolutely necessary. But his presence haunted the film. He became a living ghost, a reminder of what the West actually was versus what movies had turned it into. When the film wrapped, McQueen disappeared. Fonda tried to find him years later to thank him, but nobody in the area had heard of him. Some people on set swear he was never really there at all. At number 14, the film's most iconic shot was a complete accident. Fonda wanted to capture Harry riding away from his family at dawn, silhouetted against the rising sun. They set up the shot, positioned the horse, waited for the light. But just as Zygmunt started rolling, a flock of birds, hundreds of them, suddenly took flight from the trees behind Harry, filling the frame with dark, chaotic movement. It should have ruined the take, but Zygmunt kept filming, and Fonda watched in awe as the image transformed into something mythic. Harry became a tiny figure against an erupting sky, nature itself seeming to mourn his departure. They couldn't recreate it if they tried. The birds never returned. The light shifted. That single unrepeatable moment became the film's most enduring image, printed on posters, analyzed in film schools, remembered by everyone who saw it. Fonda later said, "I spent months planning every shot in that movie, and the one people remember forever is the one I had nothing to do with. The desert gave it to us. We just had the sense not to ruin it." In a film about surrendering to forces beyond your control, even the filmmaking itself became an act of surrender. Number 15. Bruce Langhorne's tree dulcimer was destroyed 3 days before the final recording session. Someone at the studio, moving equipment carelessly, knocked it over. The instrument shattered, strings snapping, wood splintering, decades of Langhorne's craftsmanship reduced to debris in seconds. Langhorne was devastated. He'd built the tree over 5 years, and its unique sound couldn't be replicated. The score was barely half finished. Fonda feared they'd have to start over with a completely different approach. Maybe hire a traditional composer, give the studio the safe Western score they'd always wanted. But Langhorne refused to quit. He gathered the broken pieces, salvaged what strings he could, and spent 2 days rebuilding a smaller, rougher version of the instrument. It didn't sound the same. It was rawer, more fragile, with notes that wobbled and died too quickly. But when Langhorne played it for Fonda, they both realized something. The broken instrument sounded exactly like the film felt. Damaged, haunted, beautiful because it survived. They recorded the rest of the score on that wounded tree, and the trembling, uncertain quality of those final pieces became the emotional core of the soundtrack. Sometimes brokenness is more honest than perfection. The hired hand understood that better than any Western before or since. Number 16. Fonda hid a director's cut from Universal for almost 30 years. When the studio demanded changes before release, Fonda complied publicly, but kept his original assembly safe. The theatrical version ran 90 minutes. Fonda's cut was 130 minutes, with entire subplots, extended silences, and a different rhythm that turned the film from a Western into something closer to a European art film. He buried the negative in a vault, told no one where it was, and waited. For decades, the only version available was the studio's truncated edit. Critics praised it, but Fonda knew they were only seeing a shadow of what he'd intended. Then, in 2001, a restoration company approached him about a new print. Fonda agreed, but only if they could find his original cut. It took 6 months of searching through archives before they located it, untouched since 1971. When Fonda finally watched his version again after 3 decades, he cried, "This is what I made," he said. "This is what I wanted people to see." The director's cut premiered at the Telluride Film Festival in 2001. The audience sat in stunned silence as the credits rolled. And finally, The Hired Hand existed the way Fonda had always dreamed it. Whole, uncompromising, true.
You shooting?
Harry, what are you doing?
They cut off one of Arch's fingers. One each week, they say, till I get there. Arch is in this trouble because of me. I have to get him out of it.
Number 17. Verna Bloom's final scene was filmed without her knowledge. Fonda wanted to capture Hannah's face as she watches Harry ride away, possibly forever. But he knew if Bloom was aware the camera was rolling, she might perform the moment. He wanted something raw, so he set up a hidden camera at a distance. Telephoto lens focused on the window where Hannah would stand. He told Bloom they were adjusting equipment, taking light readings, not actually filming. Then he signaled to Oates to mount his horse and ride. Bloom, standing at the window waiting for her cue, watched him go. She didn't know the camera was recording. For 30 seconds, her face went through every emotion: grief, anger, resignation, maybe even relief. She wasn't acting. She was just watching a man leave. And for that brief moment, she was Hannah. When Fonda yelled, "Cut," Bloom realized what had happened. She was furious, felt betrayed, violated even. Fonda apologized but kept the footage. And when she finally saw it in the finished film, she stopped arguing. "I hate that you did that," she told him. "But I've never been better on screen." It's a controversial technique, ethically questionable, but it captured something unrepeatable, a moment of absolute truth that no amount of preparation could achieve. Number 18. The film cost $895,000 to make and took in less than $100,000 at the box office. Universal lost money on every single print. Fonda's directing career stalled for over a decade. Zsigmond struggled to get hired because studios thought his work was too artsy. Alan Sharp's script became a cautionary tale in Hollywood about letting actors rewrite material. By every conventional measure, The Hired Hand was a failure. But something strange happened over the years. Film schools started teaching it. Cinematographers studied its use of natural light. Directors like Terrence Malick and Kelly Reichardt cited it as a major influence. The slow cinema movement embraced it as a foundational text. And gradually, the people who'd made it started getting calls from younger filmmakers asking how they did it, what they were thinking. Could they talk about the process? By the 1990s, The Hired Hand had become one of the most influential westerns ever made. Its fingerprints visible in everything from the assassination of Jesse James to Meek's cutoff. It didn't make money. It didn't win awards. It just quietly changed the way people thought about what a Western could be. And sometimes, that's worth more than box office or Oscar gold. Sometimes, the failures are the ones that matter most. Number 19. Peter Fonda only directed one more film after The Hired Hand. And it took him 27 years to make it. The commercial failure of his debut crushed him. He returned to acting, took paycheck roles, appeared in B-movies and television, anything to survive. He'd mentioned wanting to direct again, but studios wouldn't touch him. The Hired Hand had become his albatross, proof that actors should stay in front of the camera. So he waited, he studied, he watched the film's reputation slowly grow. And in 1998, he finally got another shot, directing a thriller called The Hired Gun. It was competent, professional, forgettable. Nothing like The Hired Hand. When asked why he hadn't made something more personal, more experimental, Fonda said, "I already made that film. I don't need to make it again." He seemed at peace with the idea that The hired hand might be his only real statement as a director. And maybe that was enough. Some artists spend their whole lives searching for one perfect thing to say. Fonda said it in 1971, in the desert, with a broken dulcimer and a blind cinematographer and actors who rewrote their lines in the dirt. He spent the rest of his life living with what he'd made, watching it slowly find the audience it deserved, and never apologizing for a single frame. Number 20. On the final day of shooting, the entire cast and crew participated in a ritual nobody planned. They were wrapping the last scene, packing equipment, preparing to leave the desert location they had called home for 3 months. Someone, nobody remembers who, started walking into the wilderness. Then another person followed, then another. Within minutes, the entire production, actors, crew, Fonda, everyone, was walking silently into the desert at sunset, spreading out across the landscape until they couldn't see each other anymore. They stayed there, alone with the land, until the sun disappeared completely. No words were spoken, no goodbyes were said. They just stood in the darkness, listening to the wind, feeling the immensity of the space around them. Then, one by one, they walked back to camp. It was as if they needed to say goodbye, not just to the film, but to the place that had changed them, the emptiness that had filled them with something they couldn't name. Years later, when people asked what making The Hired Hand was like, they all described that final walk. Not the scenes they shot, or the fights they had, or the beauty they captured. Just that moment of silence in the desert, standing alone, feeling the weight of everything they'd tried to say about loneliness and longing and the American West. That moment when the film stopped being a film and became a memory they'd carry forever. Bonus fact. There's a ghost in The Hired Hand, and most people never see it. In 3 separate scenes, a figure appears in the background, distant, barely visible, watching from hilltops or doorways. It's not credited in the film, nobody ever mentions it, but if you look closely, frame by frame, it's there. For years, people assumed it was a crew member accidentally caught in frame. But in a 2003 interview, Vilmos Zsigmond revealed the truth. It was a homeless man who wandered onto the set during the first week and refused to leave. He didn't cause trouble, didn't ask for anything, just watched from a distance. Fonda eventually told the crew to leave him alone, and Zsigmond started intentionally framing shots to include him. He became part of the landscape, Zsigmond explained, like a spirit that belonged to that place. When filming wrapped, the man disappeared. They never learned his name, never saw him again. But he's there, in the film. A genuine ghost haunting a movie about ghosts. In a Western that blurred the line between reality and memory, between what was planned and what simply happened, maybe it's fitting that even the extras were mysteries. The Hired Hand wasn't just a film. It was a doorway to something older, stranger, and more true than any story Hollywood could have written. The Hired Hand didn't conquer the box office. It barely survived, but it haunted everyone who saw it. A Western that moved like a dream and cut like a knife. Peter Fonda bet everything on silence, and the world told him he was wrong. But time has a way of correcting mistakes. And now, 50 years later, The Hired Hand stands as one of the most quietly devastating films ever made about the American West, about freedom and its cost, about the people we leave behind, and the ones we can never reach again. And remember, some trails you walk alone. This was one of them.